I'm Professor Richard Johnston from Swansea University, based within the engineering department, but I'm a material scientist and engineer, mostly working on imaging, characterization using microscopes, and I apply that to the human-made world, but also the biological world around us, and sometimes historical artifacts, like the Egyptian animal mummies that we're going to look at today. Okay. As I mentioned, I'm from Swansea University, and I run an imaging facility. We're going to look at these animal mummies and how we work on those. But firstly, it's important to point out that the science and research I'm talking about is ongoing, current. Some recent bits have been published, but it's a team effort. And so it wouldn't be the same without the Egyptologists, the zoo archaeologists, the biologists, and the material scientists and microscopists. And we all come together bringing our expertise. And pretty much any science you hear about currently will be a team effort of people with diverse backgrounds, diverse experience, bringing different things to the research. So we all have our own expertise and link in together. It's important to also respectfully acknowledge the people of ancient Egypt who created these artifacts that we're going to talk about today. So thousands of years ago, these were created by people, and we're using technology to try and understand them in a new way today. And as I said, we're going to look at animal mummies. So we're going to look at how we use modern day technology to reveal something that was created thousands of years ago, to be the first people in 2000 years to see the inside of these mummified wrappings. Very briefly, what are animal mummies? So I'm going to be talking about things that are around about 2000 years or older than 2000 years old. And there were 6 categories roughly of animal mummies, and I'll run through those very, very briefly, just to give some context. So some were pets buried with their owner. Some were victual mummies. That means for food, kind of in the afterlife. Some were sacred animals, which were worshipped during their lifetime. Others were votive offerings. That means they were offerings in burial processes, and they depicted the gods and were placed in temples as offerings around that time. Others were false or amalgams. So that would be potentially you have a mummified package, but nothing in there, or bits of bone from something else. So not necessarily false, but they weren't what they were represented to be. And then a 6th category of other. But we're going to focus on votive offerings, these offerings to the gods. So these were produced in the late period, so over 2000 years ago. And it's estimated that there were over 70 million animal mummies produced, which is like staggering. That's a huge number. That's more than the number of people who live in the UK currently. So, 70 million, imagine that. That's a huge number. And these were given to gods, and certain animals were acceptable to certain gods. But we're trying to think of 70 million. That's a gigantic number. And so that requires almost industrial scale rearing of animals for the process of mummification, and then industrial scale mummification processes as well. And when you imagine something that large, then you get society and practices that are developed around that. And so produced in a certain way, and society builds themselves around such an activity potentially. So mummified animals can give us an insight into society of the past, not just of this animal and what's inside those wrappings. And so, comparison to modern day, you might think 70 million animals, oh, this is, being reared and mummified is, that's not nice to hear about. But actually, we look at our current practices as society today, and we can consider how perhaps not ideal those practices are in terms of animal welfare. It's a good time to point out some researchers in this area. I'm a material scientist X-raying these mummified remains, but you also have Professor Salima Ikram, who's an expert in animal mummies and has a show on Netflix at the moment, and Dr. Lydia McKnight, also an expert in animal mummies and imaging as well. So we're going to use X-ray vision. That's what I've used to look at these animal mummies and to try and show something different. So that's the skills and the capabilities we have in our department. We have the ability to use X-rays to look inside things. And so firstly, mummified animals and mummified remains, were beginning to look at them in the 1800s, but most of the techniques were invasive or intrusive. And so you'd have a mummified package and it would be unwrapped by hand, which is a destructive process. Then came along X-rays and the development of X-ray imaging to allow us to image large-scale human mummies and then animal mummies. So this is an example of a human mummy, an X-ray through the coffin, effectively, and you can start to see loads of interesting things, really interesting insight into that mummy without destructively unwrapping it. But it's low resolution. For animal mummies, that doesn't really cut it. And so that's medical X-ray CT. That's those big circular tubes where, you know, you may have had a medical CT or know someone who's had a medical CT scan. What we use is microtomography. And so this is an example of X-ray microtomography where we effectively reveal the inside of something non-destructively, but we do it on small things. And so we talked about that whole animal mummy, that would be a whole human mummy, that would be rather large. But what we can do is something like this. So this is an example of a chocolate egg with a toy inside, where we're able to X-ray the inside of that, look at that structure inside, digitally remove the chocolate and the plastic that's around it to study that bear, in this case, inside. And I still have this chocolate egg toy thing in the lab intact. I could take it back to the shop if I wanted to and get my money back. But effectively, that's what we're able to do with X-ray microtomography. Look at small things inside other containers and be able to study them. And then what we can also do is take that and 3D print the insides. So from this Kinder Egg, I was able to take the toy out digitally, and I can reproduce this. I've printed hundreds of these bears, and I've never opened that chocolate egg toy. But how does that help us with mummies? So on the left, we've got an example of a mummified package from the Egypt Center at Swansea University. To X-ray that, we'd see the middle image, which is just kind of X-ray through, but we can't really tell what we're looking at. And then X-ray microtomography is 3D X-raying. And so that video on the right shows us digitally removing the wrappings to show this coiled snake inside. So why do we do that? Why are we using X-rays to look inside things? Well, firstly, it's non-destructive. So that package has remained so for 2,000 years. So we shouldn't really come along and unwrap that package and destroy the wrappings. And so with this, we've got X-ray imaging that's non-destructively looking inside. But it's just a tool really to help reveal those stories of the past. And we teamed up with the Egypt Center, a museum in Swansea University, which had these artifacts with our collaborators there. And I also have this imaging facility on the same campus. So the Advanced Imaging of Materials facility, we have all of these techniques, which we can throw at various materials from jet engines to animal mummies. And it's about curiosity. Who doesn't like looking inside something that no one has ever seen for 2,000 years? But it's also about interdisciplinarity and these characterization tools. So can we tell stories of the past using all of these things? So it started with the snake. We firstly had this package. The Egypt Center had taken it to a vet's years ago and had this 2D X-ray image, which is okay, it shows it's a snake. And we put it in our X-ray microtomography machine and we can see it's a snake again. But the key thing is we do that in 3 dimensions. So rather than just this 2D image that you can tell is a snake, but you haven't got the positions of any of the bones, there's no context to that. We now have this 3D image because we've rotated our sample while X-ray imaging, and we can generate high resolution 3D data. So we have this now, we can digitally unwrap non-destructively, so we're not breaking it. We digitally unwrap this mummified snake to try and tell us more. And from that, we were able to have, this representation. It's still intact in the museum, but we can zoom into certain bits and we can identify possible cause of death of the snake 2,000 years ago. And so we've got this separation of the vertebra, and we think that's through a whipping action. So, you take a bull whip or just a whip and you whip it. That's a method of killing snakes even today. And so you whip them and it effectively fractures the vertebra and kills the snake. So we think, thousands of years later, we've identified a method of killing them. And then we wanted to zoom into the head. So we need to get inside even closer to look at some of the structures within the head and to help us identify the species. So we can zoom into the head. And we do that, and it gave us this whole new data set, another three-dimensional data set at high resolution, where we've got the head structure. We can see damage to the head that's happened through the process. Our biologist, Dr. Rhys-Jones in Cardiff, was able to identify the species as an Egyptian cobra. So now we know the species, we know potentially how it was killed. And also these other furry structures here are calcified kidneys. And so from that, we can identify that it was potentially dehydrated before its death, which can give us insight into how it was kept. Maybe it didn't have enough water at the time, because snakes drink water, which would have led to dehydration and calcification of these kidneys. And so we get the species identification to be an Egyptian cobra. We have these calcified kidneys, which showed up clearly within the X-ray. We also identified these structures within the mouth, which have a very precise placement, which potentially suggest a complex mummification ritual as well, which hasn't been seen before in snakes, all through being able to do this high resolution X-ray imaging. And then I can take that data again. So we have our 3D data, and I can put that into virtual reality. So I can effectively put myself within the 3D data. And so in this view, you're seeing the view from my 3D VR goggles, and I can make this snake skull as big as my house. And I can tour around that snake. There's a good video next. So I can tour around that snake. I can go inside the skull and look at the organization of the skull. I can look at all of the fractures and how they may have happened. And I can find these tiny, tiny inserts. Because this skull in real life is about the size of my thumbnail. It's a really small, quite a juvenile snake, but I can make the skull as big as my house. I can crawl through the vertebra of the snake and come across that fractured part where effectively it was whipped. And here I am inside the skull of the snake. Then I can take the data and I can 3D print that. So now we have something that's still inside the wrappings, but I can hold it and I can touch it, and that can help me identify the species of snake as well by being able to feel the ridges of the bones and the skull. And we can print that even bigger. And so the skull is this big, but we can 3D print something this large, and it just represents it in a different way, enables us to see more. And so we've identified the possible causes of death, possible conditions while alive, some of the mummification processes. We've identified the species as an Egyptian cobra, and some of the ritualistic practices at the time. So what else can we do? We can look at some slightly larger mummified samples, but what can you do? So you could explore this data at home. So we've put the two data sets, simplified data sets of the snake skull, but also a mummified cat skull, onto somewhere called Figshare. So you can move those around and manipulate them and make them bigger on your screen. And if you've got a VR headset, you could make them as big as your house and crawl within them. At this point, it's crucial to acknowledge my cat, who was very, very helpful when we were analyzing mummified cat skulls. So I could quickly measure her head and compare it to the mummified cat that we were looking at. And it turns out that it was a kitten. It was a lot smaller than my cat. But also the Egypt Center at Swansea, visit the museum if you're able to. And that's that. That's the end of that. So thank you. Hopefully you found that interesting. And yeah, I'll leave it there. But that's mummified animals with X-rays.